Welcome to MINDSHOCK. This is your host, Bruce McGuire. And we are launching our watch party series. This will be the first documentary film, or any kind of film, to have a watch party on MINDSHOCK. So, as requested by listeners, this will be part logical analysis, part watch party. So it will not be an in-depth point-by-point logical analysis like an illogical analysis on MindShock, but it will be more of a laid-back, chill stream watch party podcast. So, I actually have not seen this before, so this will be a blind watch or first time watch for me as well. So, yeah, I'm just looking through the comments here. Justin Johnson stating, "ScrewTube loves Bruce. This should go without a hitch." Oh man, we need to have a poll. I need to put a poll up real quick on who thinks we're actually going to make it through this. So, vote in the poll here. Will YouTube shut this stream down? Welcome. Kill the bank. Use your illusions. Haley, Alien, Big Cat, Tsutsaka, our favorite Dunning-Kruger goof in the house. Jeff's wig. Globe Thrusters. Also, first time going to be watching Old World Order. Christopher Allen in here. Null Order. Sam Pedro. We got a lot of people in here. Yes, Christopher Allen. This is fair use, as we will be logically analyzing and commentating in edutainment fashion for logical veracity. I will not be stopping it every second, though. There is no logical fallacy counter. Okay, the poll here, will YouTube shut this down? 53% yes. Oh, 56. So it's edging that way. I'm not sure though. I haven't seen the content of this documentary, so I'm not really sure, but just given the general nature of anything anti-establishment, anything not peddling the mainstream narrative for the corrupt is generally messed with, shut down, or censored in some capacity. And this channel in particularly, ever since I did the top secret occult NASA patches, that stream got shut down, and ever since then, there have been quite a few glitches, shall we call them. But before that podcast, there really weren't any. I mean, some lag here and there, which I'm sure is normal. YouTube servers aren't perfect, but no major issues until that occult NASA patch podcast. So, oh wow, jumping to 59%. Oh, back to 56. Okay. Okay, so anything we gotta go over before we jump into this? I don't really know what this is about. I'm assuming it's some kind of Tartaria mud flood. I don't know how much flat earth overlap there is. We watched the teaser earlier in the week, and apparently BJ Penn is in this, which definitely piqued my interest. Most MMA aficionados are familiar with one of the pound-for-pound greats, the Hawaiian BJ Penn. Fought all the way from featherweight to heavyweight throughout his career. I am not sure any other MMA fighter has done so. Certainly not any other MMA fighter with the amount of titles that BJ Penn had, both official and unofficial. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll. 58% think we will get shut down, but we will see. I mean, I'm not sure. Again, I don't know the exact content here. But let's jump right in. So this is Sean Hibbler, for those familiar with him. I haven't seen a lot of Hibbler content, I have to say. I am not that familiar with him, other than he's a flat earther and he's on a number of podcasts. Also, call me crazy, I'm not sure I know who Stu Peters is either. He sounds really familiar. Is he on a lot of podcasts as well? You know what they should have done here, though? So, I mean, this has been translated a few different ways. History is a pack of lies agreed upon, is what I have seen stated, allegedly attributed to Napoleon. And that's what we should put here, allegedly. Because how do we know, especially if history is a pack of lies agreed upon, how do we know that this quote isn't a lie from Napoleon? How do we know Napoleon even existed?
From every corner of the earth sits glorious architecture. Magnificent structures that allegedly have no connection, yet very similar designs. This style of architecture, riddled with elegance and purpose, can be found in your neighborhood or in the middle of nowhere. And when you walk in, you are overwhelmed with a vibrant feeling of serenity, a feeling that modern-day architecture does not provide. The concept of a timeline that once existed, where structures were created with a completely different purpose. Yet, when we take a look back at who they told us built these structures, considering the timeline and the lack of technology, the story begins to crumble. And that story was taught to us all during a time when we were too young to question it. But when you shine an unbiased light upon the history books, you'll quickly uncover the lies of his story. But even before Rockefeller and his goons started the Board of Education, they already had our ancestors, and anyone who questioned their narrative would soon find themselves an unwilling resident of the original indoctrination camps. And where did they come from? Where did we all come from?
This is actually really well done. I didn't, from the teaser trailer, I didn't really get that good of an impression. I mean, it didn't really reveal the production value, but this is actually really well done. I thought it'd be more amateurish, but it's quite professional. Quite professional indeed. And for those who don't know how the American school system, aka indoctrination facility camp, started, it was actually Horace Mann imported this system from Prussia, where they specifically wanted soldiers willing to die on the front lines, and also factory workers who didn't ask questions and then just worked at the factory bell to bell to bell in a very structured fashion.
If knowledge is truly power, then maintaining such power must rely on the absence of knowledge. Are you aware that every major city in America experienced a great fire? Candle fires that turned stone to dust, leaving behind a...
No surprise the Tootsaka goof in the chat thinks a word used has something to do with production value. He thinks it has something to do with editing, or the music, or any of the composition. Oh man, I hope Tootsaka sticks around for this whole thing. We love the Dunning-Kruger stylings of Tootsaka.
Crime scene that resembles a war zone. Let's take a giant step back, perform our own investigations, question the history that was written by these victors.
I do recall that CIA document. I remember seeing that, I think even on the first or second episode of MINDSHOCK Altered History. If you haven't checked out the podcast series here on MINDSHOCK Altered History, we go through everything from Fomenko's New Chronology to Mud Flood, Tartaria, etc.
With a growing nationwide lack of trust for our leaders, it's time to discover the extent of the deceit and where the lie truly began.
I mean, this looks like it could easily be a History Channel documentary. I mean, the production value, I am really, really impressed here. I mean, again, the teaser trailer didn't really reveal what the production value would be. I mean, it didn't look like garbage or anything, but it didn't look like the production value was this high. I mean, this is pretty good.
What's being kept from us is huge. And you're talking earlier about the architecture. I really like to encourage people to do their research in their own communities, because you really do not have to go far to start chipping away at what they've told us and ask yourself a question: is this even possible? Is it possible that X building was built in the 1890s? And they're giving us timelines of like a year. It was built in a year. They want us to believe we didn't have the technology, that we were low tech, and yet we're building all of these amazing structures.
It's almost like it's some kind of humiliation ritual to see what kind of goofs believe that this could have been built the way the so-called powers that be, the corrupt establishments, maintain and purport. If you haven't checked out the definitive Mud Flood Tartaria Altered History podcast on MindShock, I did a long deep dive live stream a couple weeks ago on this, where we actually looked up the population of some of these small towns. And again, let's say they did have high level technology. Why would a small town of a couple hundred or a couple thousand people even need buildings this gigantic right next to their wooden shanty where they parked their horse and buggies? Yeah. Like, let's say they magically had the tech. Why would they use it for that to put next to their shanty?
This disparity between what the narrative says and what's actually there.
You have places, cities in America that look as though they were constructed in medieval Europe, when nothing was here and people showed up and just got started building, from what we're told. One would assume that they would build with the means that were available to them. Wood, nails if they were lucky. What we get is this narrative that people were showing up and really making do with what they had.
What we learn about in school is there was nothing here. This land was free for the taking. The only inhabitants were wild Indians, and we built everything here. Everything you see in this country, in North America, because we're talking about Canada too, was built by us. After we got here, nothing here. They had to change the narrative. They had to destroy the evidence. They had to come up with an explanation for who built this, why they built it, when they built it. And they had to do that for a lot of buildings.
We are told that during the 1800s, the consensus of North America was low.
I mean, look at these graphics. I mean, this is impressive stuff. I mean, this could legitimately be aired on the History Channel.
Extremely low. Too low to justify the infrastructure within the timelines they've provided. Too low to have the experience or knowledge on crafting these glorious buildings.
They're the most exquisite buildings I've ever seen, and there was only a population of a few thousand people at that time. And then I'm looking and there's mud roads and wooden sidewalks. And then I'm looking at this building that is just, it could be out of Paris or Prague. It's not computing. And so I'm realizing there again, there's a whole bunch of stories that have to be dug into, rethought, reconsidered, and in some cases completely discarded.
We no longer build like that. How does that happen in a realistic timeline? Wouldn't you be progressing year after year to have incredible buildings? Today, we would be building massive pyramids, massive courthouses that last forever. Instead, we have the complete opposite. And they're very cheap. The tools have upgraded supposedly, yet our construction has gotten worse. It's completely backwards.
There's evidence of a worldwide culture that existed in the not too distant past, and the evidence is everywhere. It's an interesting thing because, like, I've spent a lot of my life looking into ancient history and traveling around the world searching into the past, and it isn't until recently that I realised that it's actually, I don't have to travel to Egypt or anywhere. It's all right there in Sydney and in London and in San Francisco, and it's all around the world. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. All you got to do is look at the civilization you're living in with the right type of eyes, and you're sort of looking around your city and you're going, well, hang on, what's this building doing here? And why is there a building just like that in the Philippines?
What really gets me are these single-piece stone columns. 'Cause, I mean, did a horse and buggy really transport these large single pillars? I mean, I mean, just the weight. I mean, forget the. I mean, not just the weight, but the length and the bulk. I mean, it's absolutely incredible. Especially in these small towns and deserts so far away from anything, and they just magically transported it there just to put up these types of extraordinary Greco-Roman type buildings right next to their wooden shanty. And the gullible coincidence theorists like Tootsaka, they just say, nothing to see here. It all checks out. Nothing strange at all. This kind of building next to a wooden shanty.
Why is there one in Japan? Apparently Japan's borders were closed, weren't they? Why are we finding what we're told is Greco-Roman style architecture in every country on earth? Was it really Greco-Roman style, or is it evidence of a culture that existed, a worldwide culture that existed right around the world in a not too distant past?
If I took a picture of this building behind me and asked any of these people, where do they think this building is in the world? I guarantee you most of them would say Rome or Europe somewhere. But no, it's right here in San Francisco. We have buildings like this all over the country. And they want us to believe that they were built in the early 1900s or the late 1800s with horse and buggy. And there's just no way that's true. These buildings were built by the prior civilization, master builders, the old world order.
This is the architecture I'm talking about. You'll find this anywhere in New Zealand, Australia, Hong Kong, North America, South America, all over Europe. It doesn't matter where you are. This architecture is replicated. The weird thing is, they akin it to being all built around the 1870s to 1900 mark. So all of the world just shit out of nowhere at the same time. There was nothing before it. Does it make any sense? I don't think antiquity is a long time ago. I think this civilization went just before us.
Was Martin Leitke, was he the crane operator who said it all didn't add up, or was that somebody else who was the large crane operator who operated some of the biggest, most powerful cranes in the world, and then they started questioning the official narrative based on that? I don't know, was that Leitke or not? Does anybody know? It was one of those original guys. It was Philip Druzadin and Martin Leitke and one or two other guys years and years ago. They were the first guys putting this on the interwebs. But plenty of other architects and construction workers have come out and also said the same thing. It doesn't add up.
You know, the Edwardians are supposed to be around the time of the First World War. So within grandparents' living memory, yet we know nothing about them. It's the control mechanism that covers it up with the education system. They got the news, they got the narrative, they got, you know, the mainstream to tell you how things are, but the reality is completely different. History goes to the victors. Okay, somebody invaded this place and took over a beautiful through jealousy, using trade routes, using the sea. And they took over this place. They covered all of this fine architecture with their iconography. So there's literally been a cover-up of history in more than one way.
If you look at Capitol buildings all over the earth, they look the same. They do. They've got columns, they've got domes. It was not random. And every story we're told in our historical narrative about how a place got started was some guy was the first settler there, bought some land, subdivided it, sold it, and pretty soon you have a city.
What's also strange is that there aren't new cities. You would think there'd be a whole bunch of new cities popping up, just with all the tech. And even the population and economy booms, you know, throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, post-World War II. You would think there'd be new cities popping up everywhere. Yet it's the same 30 plus thousand cities and towns that there have always been. It's weird in the US anyway. I mean, I assume that's, I mean, in other countries, are there new cities popping up all the time? I don't know. Justin Johnson in the chat saying cathode and node, the buildings were machines themselves, harnessing the ether energy and distributing it. The castles, cathedrals, or cathedrals, and churches, generators, resonators, and batteries. Yeah, I mean, there was some going on. And of course, the victors do write the history books. It's amazing how many coincidence theorists, how many of these authority worshipping, gullible goof bootlickers. I mean, I'm sure they've heard the expression the victors write the history books, and yet they put their blind faith in all the history books. It's weird. Or like the history books stamped with the approval of the corrupt establishment. Like, they can only bootlick the corrupt establishment. It's like they can't bootlick any neutral sources or alternative sources. They can only bootlick the known corrupt establishment. It's an interesting thing, but that's the way coincidence theorists operate.
But the whole narrative is based, especially in North America, that there wasn't anything there. And we built it all.
You can look at it, the whole building was a work of art. So there was obviously some pride that went behind that. It wasn't just about making money and throwing shit up as fast as you could. It was about building with a purpose, and that there was symbolism behind these things.
They built them to last. They built them with a certain level of artistry and attention to detail and customization. You see, now you'll go through a neighborhood and every home looks the same. This neighborhood, perfect example. But everything had its own identity, and it was steeped in customization and ornate attention to detail.
We don't get that now.
You don't get that now.
Even when you look at the beauty of the buildings from that Tartarian era, if people were actually paying for labour, and you had to get carpenters in there, no, you'd never build buildings like that if you're working by an hourly rate. You'd just be getting it functional. People used to build that stuff because they love to build, because beauty is actually a function. Beauty is actually a function of a creation. When you're living in a world of beauty, your soul expands, and it's expansive. You can create. You can become all that you can be. And if you can become all that you can be, you sure as hell don't need rulers. So that's why they don't want you to know about any of this sort of stuff. Now, I know we're at the pinnacle of our civilization now. This is the best it gets. The best we've ever done. Look at the quality of these walls. Hey, fuck that Gothic shit. Look at this. You know? I mean, yeah.
When I was like 8 years old, I started researching the pyramids and stuff because no one knew how they were built, you know? So I started looking into ancient history. And as I said, I'd spent most of my life traveling around the world looking at all these ancient sites, and then suddenly you see this civilization that's right there under your nose. It's been there the whole time in all of our Western cities. They covered everything up. It wasn't just inserting the Dark Ages, they changed everything. So when we start even trying to piece it together through the history that they've given us, how do we know any of these places are even the names that we're told they are? How do we know any of these things? How do we know any of the history is true? Because it's not they just put it all together and just shuffle the deck and throw it out to a bunch of countries and name them whatever they want. So it's become extraordinarily difficult to try to trace it through any mainstream history records. All we've got to really go on is the architecture itself.
I mean, just look how absolutely stunning this is. I mean, it's almost like it was built with just the intention to inspire awe. I mean, this is awe-inspiring. Unlike, you know, the boxy garbage or the shanties. I mean, that doesn't really inspire awe. I mean, but these buildings, I mean, these truly inspire awe.
It wasn't thousands of years ago. It was just hundreds of years ago. Even if you go down to South America and look at some of the temples down there, the edges on them, the beveling on them, this is only a few hundred years old. This is not old ancient structures. These are new walls. I've gone there and looked at them myself. You know, nothing is what they tell us. You know, everything is a lie. It's just how big the lie is.
Rob in the chat saying, hey, MindShock guy, I'm glad you're considering this old world stuff. Have you checked out the Altered History podcast series on MindShock? I've been going over this stuff for years, and I've actually been researching it since way back. It actually, I don't think I mentioned this. I might have mentioned this in the Tartaria Mudflood deep dive a couple weeks ago, the deep dive live stream I did. Maybe you didn't see that either, Rob. But I wanted a single definitive stream where we kind of went over absolutely everything in as concise a fashion as possible. And back, even just examining Atlantis, I first saw this theory that Atlantis was a worldwide civilization. I want to say maybe around 2008, maybe, if I'm just randomly pulling a year. Around 2008, there were theories circulating online. Ancient aliens might have possibly even touched upon it in an episode. Kind of hazy. I haven't watched Ancient Aliens. I've only seen the first couple seasons. I mean, I know they've been pretty extensive, a lot of disinfo on those as well. But they do touch upon some interesting topics as well, especially the earlier seasons. And this whole topic of a worldwide civilization, I mean, I was looking at this stuff back in the 2000s, and then as soon as Anatoly Fomenko's new chronology kind of got popular around the time of Philip Druzadin, who I forget when his YouTube channel came up. I mean, it was a number of years ago now, maybe 7, 8 years ago. And they kind of connected those dots. So that was kind of the foundation. All of this Tartaria stuff kind of makes sense if you're familiar with worldwide Atlantean civilization theories, as well as Fomenko's new chronology. Like, coming off of that, this really isn't that shocking.
Yeah, and the bigger the lie is, the easier it is for people to believe it.
There's a lot of architecture in the world today on every continent of buildings that are much, much larger than you would think people of our height would build. And so I gave the example of the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C. as being one of those buildings. The Basilica, the National Shrine at Catholic.
And just to add real quick, you say you're new to the channel, as well as any other new listeners, if you haven't heard of Fomenko's new chronology, Fomenko was, I believe he was the youngest math professor, was at the University of Moscow, some university in Russia, or the Soviet Union rather. Then he got exiled for his theories, but Fomenko was this super genius who also studied astronomy and history, and he noticed that the records of astronomical events like eclipses, etc., they didn't match the written historical record. And this also connects to whether there's an I or a J, and whether or not this I or J was in front of the year. So, for example, 1300 could have been I or J 300, 300 years post-Christ as opposed to 1300. So there might be literally 1,000 years added to the timeline. So anyway, and then Fomenko also identified just these regurgitation of common stories and just the funny business and the historical narrative in general. So he was exiled. I believe he was allowed to return back to Russia and possibly did after the collapse of the Soviet Union. If you haven't checked out the AI analysis on why the Soviet Union collapsed and all of the great conspiracies regarding that, I actually have a custom AI analysis as well on the channel. You could check that out. But yeah, just a quick background on Fomenko for those not familiar with him. He's been going over this stuff for years and years and decades and decades.
University in Washington is another example. A huge, huge building.
Look at the Texas state capitol. It's incredible. You've got these pillars around the whole area. It's kind of the same thing as the Vatican.
I do wonder about Iolani Palace. How old is it? And one thing to look at is
It took them 2 years, from 1880 to 1882. How did they build that beautiful, beautiful building? Was that building here longer? Was it here before Captain Cook? There's no construction pictures and there's none of that stuff. So no power tools, horse and buggy. How is that even possible?
When you have St. John's Cathedral in New York City, that's not a style of cathedral. That's the real McCoy.
Could you imagine that being built today? I think that everybody would go crazy.
They have no legitimacy whatsoever, except to trick us and convince us that they do. And that's how they've managed to get away with this. So they could insert themselves in and set themselves up as overlords.
Stone building is not just something you can pick up and teach a convict in a matter of weeks, like we're told about Americas and Australia. Truly, that's how we're told these countries were built.
Just extremely sophisticated and technical engineering involved. And you know, there's so many questions that come to mind. How'd they do it? If they were our size, how could they even accomplish this with the technology we were told we had at the time?
You'll find many of the banks, post offices, government centers, especially 100 years ago, were facilitated in these large, glorious stone structures.
You know what else is kind of interesting? Why are these never non-government buildings? It's like all of these are government, mind control, governmentalis, the mind, mental. All of these mind control, aka government buildings, it's always government buildings that these are used for. I mean, why wasn't this either some kind of non-profit or some kind of private build? It's always the government buildings. I mean, isn't that kind of weird? Matthew shit with 3 Z's. I remember a conversation with a construction guy saying here in Austria we are not allowed to build or dig deeper than 20 meters. Why is that? I've heard similar things in the US as well, that there's a limit to how deep you can go. I don't know why that would be in terms of allowed, or is that just like typically permitted? And if you have billions of dollars, you can do it anyway? I mean, I don't know.
So, number one, the rulers wanted the stronger, more durable, more imposing structures for themselves. That sends a message to the people you're ruling over. We're going to play a little game here with 2 alternatives, right? And you or I, whoever the person deciding between these 2 is, I'd like for you to pretend you're a world leader. You're not a good one. You're evil and you'd like to rule the people underneath your thumb. Or you're looking to maintain control over people. Bear with me and envision these 2 alternatives. In the first, we have the opinion, the theory, the teachings, the paradigm that man is nothing but a carnivorous monkey in outer space, floating on a rock for no reason.
Magically manifesting, just sprouting from manifested rocks in space. Okay, hold on a second. So I'm going to give my main question here. This is my primary question, what I find probably the most fascinating regarding all of this. If anybody in the chat can come up with a plausible answer, feel free. But I don't have much. I just have questions here because, of course, this is MindShock. I do not claim anything is true or untrue, and the motto here, of course, is the only thing we know for sure is that we don't know anything for sure. So here's my primary question. So throughout all this time period, like before the Freemasons took the Freemasonry and found the nations, foundations, and founded cities. They found the cities and founded them. So before that, Now, was 100% of the current civilization population simply orphan trained clones or whatever? Or were there random people who did walk around these abandoned cities and just continued walking? Now, this primary question cannot be asked without considering native or aboriginal populations. So, for example, even Native Americans supposedly living the same way off the land for thousands of years. So did they occasionally go through these empty cities, and what did they think about them? Was this some kind of Walking Dead situation where natives knew about these cities? Because they do have them mapped on certain Native American maps, have these cities on them. It's actually quite fascinating. And they sometimes they even draw like some of the buildings. Were they empty? I mean, and like even let's say the natives of Brazil or Australia, I mean these native populations that supposedly had nothing to do with Tartaria or Tartarian populations or Atlantean populations. So how many different groups of humans are there? And I mean this is one of my primary questions, because even today you have people living in cities using computers and advanced tech, while there are aboriginals or native populations living in the jungle with spears the same way their ancestors supposedly did for thousands of years or longer or whatever. These populations exist simultaneously in parallel. And if you fly a helicopter to the Amazon and land it and have a cell phone, a black mirror showing you a video on the other side of the world live, these native populations will think you're a sorcerer. And this is some kind of crazy magic and sorcery because they're just not used to it. So that's really my primary question. How many different groups of humans are there? So the people that eventually moved into these found nations, are these the orphan trains or clones, or, I mean, are these, whatever, Cabbage Patch grown kids populations in incubators, clones, whatever, and these are completely different populations than natives? And obviously there was some crossbreeding going on, but how many different groups of populations are there? And I mean, this is my primary question with all of this because it's so fascinating. And to this day, there are still uncontacted tribes. There's not that many left. There's only a couple left around the world, but it's tough to think about that. And I think the answer to that question could solve this riddle. Wendy Howard in the chat says maybe it has to do with our actual blood types. There's definitely something to that. There's definitely a reason why people have different blood types. We may not know the reason, but there's definitely one. And yeah, that would answer a lot of questions. Perhaps not all of them, but that could answer a lot of questions. Matthew Schmidt. True knowledge passed away with our ancestors. I mean, I don't know. I think a lot of Native American shamans and some of these shamans from all over the world and native populations, they might have known the truth, which is maybe why the conquistadors and all of these conquerors wiped out native populations, because they knew the truth. Perhaps there's something to that as well.
In the middle of nowhere by accident. And this all got kicked off 43 bajillion years ago on a Tuesday at 6 o'clock p.m. And they can determine this with their color star charts and moon dust and things like that. And going on to a long, vast existence of nothing, just surviving by instinct, on par with an animal. Justification for any morals, ethics, no real pursuit of true happiness, no pursuit of harmony and understanding here on the earth. And this is all what we're living in today. There's no spiritual accountability. There's no understanding of beauty. Well, on the other alternative, On this side, we have a purposeful creation, a purposeful design to not only the human being, but the entire earth, the laws of nature. No theories, only laws ingrained into existence, woven into the fabric of reality by the designer, the creator, not in a linear sense, not, back then, this many years ago or that. It doesn't work that way. This is the fabric of what we live in. There is a value placed on beauty. Why? Because God has a beautiful creation. In order to return the favor, mankind has an impulse to create beautiful things.
I'm going to drop another mind-shocking theory here. And especially they had Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata playing there. I think the truth and history and all of the true knowledge of our past is actually encoded in the frequency of the music, of classical music. And that's why it's classical music, the classics. Just like I think classic literature has all these clues, fairy tales and folk tales, there's all these clues to the past hidden in them. Almost like they're hidden in plain sight. And yeah, so I think the resonance of the frequency of the classical music reveals the truth, but average people don't know how to process that. They don't know how to understand it, but it's there. And I don't know about other people, but when I hear certain pieces of classical music, like Beethoven especially, it's like it moves you, but you don't necessarily know to what. But again, your body's mostly water, and water responds to frequency. So if there's a way to read the frequency using your own body or physical or mental state, maybe that knowledge is lost or can somehow be revealed. But I think they might have encoded it in music as well. Because it's definitely encoded in language. And I've gone over that many, many times. Like even the Freemasons getting the Freemasonry and the found nations, the foundations of everything. I mean, it's all there. Language, even the phonetics, the phony phonetics of the Phoenicians. When you talk on the phone, being all phony. I mean, it's all there. It's all encoded in plain sight or plain hearing.
In recent times, this has been robbed from us, but nonetheless, it's in the soul of every human being to not only value beauty, to seek it out, to place a high, high emphasis on it. This is how the ancients maintained their ways of life. Geometric, proportional laws of beauty.
Anything like it in the whole world.
It's right in our own hometown. Grandpa, they'll never tear it down, will they?
Well, they better not.
Well, they didn't tear all of them down. Not that they put them up in the first place. The World's Fairs showcase many of our ancient structures in their grandest form. Yet, we are sold the story that these are alleged temporary buildings, all being built in record-breaking time for the purpose of a worldly gathering, a gathering to showcase new technology, or perhaps just taking credit for the old. With so many lights on display, one would only assume that power plants and electrical resources such as wiring and even electricians were widely available. However, during this time period, that wasn't the case at all. Therefore, how were these vast areas in the late 1800s able to light the evening sky? Like a modern-day theme park? Or was there a different method for harvesting energy? Now ask yourself, what part of these magnificent buildings look temporary? What part of these buildings look rushed? And most importantly, what part of these buildings look new?
I had another thought too, just talking about the secrets or the true knowledge hidden in classical music. What if it evokes a feeling in humans? Again, there's another word, human, Hue, as if we are some kind of light beings. Hue, man. But if there is some kind of truth hidden in the music, perhaps it evokes the feeling of the way things are supposed to be. Like there's a balance, and before the statist cults took over, the powers, the corrupt powers that be, whatever you want to call them, there was a state, whether it was the 1,000-year millennial reign, or however you want to describe it, or just the natural state of humanity, the way it's supposed to be. And the music kind of evokes that. That's why it makes you feel good or happy, as opposed to, let's say, death metal. Not that there's a problem with death metal. I have to admit, I've enjoyed a bit of death metal myself in the past. I don't listen to it anymore, but it's fun, whatever. Or rock and roll. But the classical music, it almost like it evokes a state of being that is the way it's supposed to be. And it's almost like everybody's soul is longing for it. It's some kind of bittersweet nostalgia that one can't quite place due to the collective amnesia of the human species.
Or you can just believe these guys.
With these World's Fairs, it was all brand new. This is what they tell us. It was meant to be temporary. So they used plaster of Paris and wood and all these other structures. And if you look at the pictures, that's not what you see. You see these massive masonry structures that look like what you see in Europe. They have these in places like Chicago, Omaha, Portland, Seattle, Guatemala. They have them in Tasmania.
Georgia, Louisiana, Ohio, Canada.
Each one of these fairs, each one was built in 2 years or less. Each one was magically populated by millions of people that came from all over the realm to participate in this event.
They started with the Crystal Palace Exposition in 1851. So what they tell us in 9 months, from the moment they conceived of it to when it was built, it was 9 months of getting it all together in this gigantic plate glass structure with fountains and trains and all the bells and whistles. Now, supposedly, they moved that entire structure to a different location in London in 1854, and that in the 1930s, that burned down. So
I like the pause at that narrative. Like, what a narrative that is. You're just moving that building just unimaginable distances, and then it just magically burns down. Because it's so easy to move giant buildings like that.
show pictures of this Crystal Palace structure, which is massive, and all the things that are there.
I mean, who's buying that? That they just up and picked this building up and just tossed it somewhere else thousands of miles away? I mean, it's almost like they make these narratives as preposterous and silly as possible just to see what kind of goofs just believe it simply because a supposed official source said it. And, like, that's the joke on what kind of goof would believe that.
Oh, we have to move that. No problem. Oops, it burned down. Which is typically what happened to a lot of these World's Fair structures.
If you could erase it from history, people don't see it as a potential future. And I think that in itself is, for me, the moral of hiding history.
I mean, they did legitimately move like mansions, sometimes brick by brick. Nothing like those buildings, like a small mansion, maybe like an 8-bedroom home. I mean, not that small, but rich people did move. There were stories about mansions being moved brick by brick, and it took years and years and then reassembled. I mean, that might be plausible if somebody was that rich and they had that much labor to put all that on ships. And I mean, they definitely didn't do it in a year. I mean, it took years and years for them to do it. But if they really wanted to move their home from like England to the US, there are stories of that. I don't know if they're true, but it seems plausible for a smaller building if they had the money and the labor. But something like this I mean, that's kind of preposterous, especially if there's no evidence of that.
About hiding the old world. It just doesn't make logical sense to me to build something so grand and then just destroy it.
Really, those was an excuse to take existing infrastructure, build some little bullshit around it, and then when you're finished with your so-called fair, it gives you an excuse to tear everything down and nobody questions.
They might have built a couple of these buildings.
Well, even the word fair, like what is fair about the fair? Is a lady fair? My fair lady? Fair ladies? An affair? Is that fair? Having an affair? I mean, that's an interesting word, fair. And you gotta pay the fare. You gotta pay the fare to go to the fair with your fair maiden, who you might have an affair with. I mean, again, just the words and the language. To think it's all coincidental. I mean, how much of a brain dead coincidence theorist must one be to think that that's all simply coincidental? From the 1300s, this is etymology, etymonline. So fair is according with propriety, according with justice, equitable, impartial, just, free from bias. So were these world fairs simply a way to establish certain populations and power centers or different countries and states, and supposedly some kind of way to do it fairly? From 1300, it was also used as promising good fortune or auspicious, fair, promising good fortune. And of course, there are fair-haired people, people with fair hair, light hair. Then there's the fairer sex, which are women. Then there's fair game, aka legitimate targets in hunting. I mean, the word fair, I mean, we have to say here, the word fair is one of the most diverse words in the English language, without question. I mean, it's quite mind-boggling, mind-shocking, if you will. Yeah, Rob in the chat says fairy, fairy. Yeah, fairies. Oh wow, you just opened a can of worms there. Now you got the whole supernatural thing going with fairies, possibly from other realms. Wow, you really had to go there with fairy. I mean, I didn't even think of that, but yes. Wow. That, again, to think it's all coincidental. Fair also means beautiful. A fair, a stated market in a town or city. A regular meeting to buy, sell, or trade. So, were they buying, selling, or trading humans at these world fairs? The humans that were to be the populations of this particular state that the fair was being held in. A fair can also mean a religious festival or holiday. A fair is a festus. Festivus for the rest of us. A fair, festus. Festus. And also, if we're going festus, you gotta go fetus, don't you? Feast, fetus, festus. Fair, fairy. And also fire. Fair, fire. Once you go down the fire rabbit, I mean, this really is, wow. The word fair, I mean, this really might be the linchpin here. Fair, fire, festus, fetus. I mean, wow. I mean, this is quite a diverse word. Also, the word fairing, like a ship fairing, F-A-I-R-I-N-G, to make fair, level, to make regular. So if there were airships, there were ship faring, F-A-I-R-I-N-G. I mean, this just goes on and on. There's also fair-minded, fair-spoken, fair ground, the grounds that the fairs go on. I mean, wow. I mean, we might do a whole 5-hour podcast just on the word fair. There's also the fairway, a navigational channel of a river, also used in golfing by 1898. The fairway. I mean, wow. Oh, this just, wow. I mean, I'm on Edom Online. It just gets crazier and crazier. Late 14th century, pleasing to the sight, fair, good-looking, beautiful, fair. Also, showy, pretended, plausible, specious. So fair is a synonym for specious. Appearance, form, figure, beauty, from species. Seemingly desirable, reasonable, or probable, superficially fair, just or correct. So now we have fair linked to specious of species, literally the entire human species. You can't make this stuff up. I mean, how much hidden truth is in the word fair? Huh. I mean, I'm not going to keep going through this, but I mean, there's a lot here. This definitely needs its own podcast just on the word fair. Oh, Rob in the chat with another good one. Warfare. Yeah. Fear. Oh, wow. Salt in the chat with fear. Fear, fair. Yeah. I mean, fear, fair, fire. Fire, fair. Everything seems to derive from the word fair. What? I mean, this is really the most mind-shocking thing of it all. World fairs and the word fair is literally linked to everything. Fear the fair. You fairy.
And you can actually tell the buildings that they built because they look like dog shit. Now, we have buildings that can hold 10,000 people, huge, giant buildings that look like they were made for a larger race of people, where they say they built it in 2 years, 600 acres, which is, I think, something like 27 million square feet. It's absolutely insane, the amount of architecture they say they built in 2 years.
As an architect and somebody who's been building my entire life, designing houses and building.
Also, the ferry, and you pay the fare on the ferry to get to the fair. Yeah, fair and square. What does the square refer to? Does that refer to the surface of the earth?
For 20 years or so. The time frames that they allow for just the planning. The idea that that could just be planned out in 2 years begs credulity.
They had these ornate buildings with all kind of moving sidewalks and crazy technology. They had ill things with so many lights, electricity, when electricity was supposed to be a new thing and all of that. They had shit that was like something out of a dream, bro.
Well, this is the exposition thing. We're fully electrified. You know, some of these examples, so they're electrified before electric was a thing. You know, the first electrified city was supposed to be Buffalo. First electrified building was supposed to be J.P. Morgan's in New York, all attributed to Edison. But these things, you know, some of them 1890s, fully electric, and it would have been free energy. They didn't have massive plants to generate electricity.
The first one in America was in 1876, and that was the Centennial World's Fair in Philadelphia. The one in 1901 in Buffalo was a major one. The 1904 in St. Louis was the Louisiana Purchase, and then the Lewis and Clark was in Portland the following year. If you define the word exposition, it's telling a story. It's setting the stage, the narration. So these World's Fairs were used as, this is the narrative that we want people to believe and go home with.
The World Fairs served to get people with the new program. They said, trains, incubator babies, this is the new norm. Fast forwarding people into the modern industrial age. Everyone's wearing the same beaver hats. Everyone's wearing the same three-piece suit. You know, it seemed like individuality had ceased to exist. The World's Fairs served the purpose of indoctrinating.
The World Columbian Exposition was one of the most superb. In Chicago, Illinois, formerly known as Chilaga, had some of the most beautiful stone masonry in the world. The area was nicknamed the White City, as each building was strategically painted bright white in an attempt to hide the inevitable aging of the structural entity. The mainstream narrative would lead you to believe that these megastructures were designed by the most educated and experienced architects. Right?
The architect, he didn't have any formal training.
What on earth would give you that idea?
Isn't that what the website said, right?
So your website.
Your website said that the architect of this building has no formal training.
That's
Here.
I find that implausible.
This is your website.
We all do. That's why.
I'm not sure if there were even any schools of architecture back then.
How did they know how to do this then? That's what we're asking. This is not built for dinosaurs, the Field Museum. It was built for something else. It's not to show off the fake dinosaur bones. It was for something else. When you walk inside, you can see the doors are much bigger than the size we are. It's nothing like what we build today.
The Museum of Science and Industry, which was the arts building, the fine arts building. And they make the argument that that was a temporary building like all the others, and the public liked it so much that they rallied to save it. So what they did is they went and rebuilt it out of granite and marble and copper and all the permanent materials that we see now. I think these are children's stories that they give us. I don't understand at all how serious-minded people can accept a story that says this building was built exactly as we see it now, but with temporary materials. And then because we liked it, it got rebuilt out of granite and marble and copper and glass. To me, that defies explanation and is much more of a fanciful tale.
Yeah, and why would they only like that building? I mean, the whole thing is quite spectacular. I went over that on the World Fairs episode of the Altered History series. If you haven't checked that out, you can check that out on MINDSHOCK. But yeah, I mean, why would they only like that one building? It's kind of weird.
Then the idea that that building was already there and was repurposed for a fair.
This one connects to the Shed Aquarium, I guarantee it, and it connects to a lot more buildings around this area. And it's not just here, it's in every single city in the world.
You know, we on top of water.
We're on water.
We on water. So we on top of water. You go in the basement, you will hit the water, hit the wall, and then sometimes when it rains, because the sewer be flooded sometimes, the water come in the basement, flood the whole basement.
Oh my God.
Thoughts on
That's exactly what we're talking about.
Before we leave it, press them on that. What do you got on that?
Okay, so there's massive tunnel systems throughout all of these buildings everywhere in the world.
Yeah.
So you're telling us right now that there's tunnels. Basically, there's a basement here. This building is much bigger than we can see on the ground surface.
It's a basement. It's a basement here. When the war, when you go in the basement, we do rounds. What we call our rounds called the ground level, and then we got upper level. Okay. So we go downstairs to certain hallways. You will hear water hitting the walls.
Wow. You have seen the tunnel systems underneath these buildings?
According to the information gathered from my grandfather, who got here in Chicago in 1969, Well, before that, as far as for what we have here from museum we're in now, from the Field Museum to the Shedd Aquarium to Soldier Field, there are the pathways underneath that are all connected.
It's like if you go to McCormick Place, if you go, they got the little tunnels over there too, because they be flooding over there too.
Really?
Yeah.
So it's connected, you think?
Yeah. So this whole campus, the whole campus is connected. And there's tunnels. I was told there's tunnels, you know what I'm saying? It's like the tunnels along the lake that you can go down in, and then it leads you into like a little path, but you know, that's...
You know what's kind of crazy too? The coincidence theorist denial of just these extensive catacomb tunnel type systems that are under just about every city in the world. Wendy in the chat says, in my city too, old buildings mixed with new. I believe the tunnels go from continent to continent. Inner Earth series, Inner Earth cities. Our whole Earth is connected. So, yeah, if you haven't checked out the Hollow Earth podcast on MindShock, I did an extensive deep dive into Hollow Earth mythology, all of that. And there does appear to be something to it. That maybe there is some kind of Hollow Earth under the surface, miles and miles below. And it's all connected. It's very, very possible. I mean, certainly every ancient civilization seems to have mythology of such. Is it all coincidental?
I heard that from somebody that he was working for 43 years.
Really?
Been here for 43 years. He been here for 43 years. He retired, I want to say, like last week sometime.
Have you ever been in them?
No, sir. They won't allow access to the public.
Okay.
And then they only allow access to very, very few of their actual workers here.
So you think that dirt in that picture downstairs, you think the dirt is actually there and we put it there to cover up this building, to make it look like it's not as big as it really is?
That's a good one. That's good. I feel like we did though. I feel like he made the picture to fake like. I feel like the building was here already.
What do you tell your child when you're coming to a new location and they're asking you questions and you have no answers? You will start to create so that way you have a way to answer those questions, or your child will grow up with no answers and forever seeking. So
now we're here to give answers.
There you go.
When they say that these buildings were temporary, what they're basically suggesting is that it's a full-scale model. That is going to be occupied by thousands and hundreds of thousands of people that are coming in and out of these fairs, where they're going to hold together through brutal winters, through hurricanes, through potential earthquakes, with hundreds and thousands of people occupying these spaces. The liability on that alone would have shut the whole endeavor down from the beginning. It wouldn't have been permitted. It's not the kind of thing that's permissible when you're talking about the building trades, when you're talking about a public facility where you're going to be bringing so many people.
Now, this takes a huge infrastructure, and it takes a huge amount of people to do something like this. When you see these ridiculous construction photos where it's like popsicle sticks, clear manipulation.
All right, so right here you can see they just put the scaffolding up, just like they've done in the past in the original pictures of the construction. Yeah, and they're doing it right now. How hard would it be to just make it black and white and then make it look like they're doing some construction right now? NASA's not the only company to fake a photo, guys.
With a lot of these old, glorious buildings, regardless of where they are, you'll find supposed, alleged construction photos. Now, many of these will show simply scaffolding around an already constructed building. If you take an old cathedral and put scaffolding around it, and you're the first person ever to have that cathedral photographed, well, you are ripe to make a case for yourself that you may have built that to begin with, whereas you might have just been renovating that cathedral, repainting it, fixing it, old, primitive photo manipulation techniques.
Wooden sidewalks and mud roads. You have to be able to bring all the stone and brick and glass and copper and all the component parts. You have to be able to bring that to the site. And so just the roads alone, like you can scratch and sniff any aspect of this and the story starts to crumble. But if you're printing these in books, or you're presenting them like on maybe a TV documentary, let's say, and it's just an image that's going to come and go. And 99.9 right percent of people looking at them are not even going to scratch their head. They're going to just say, well, there it is. There's the construction photo, and I don't need anything else, because why would I question that? That's absurd.
Also, you'll find good old-fashioned cut and pasted, someone with an X-Acto knife out in a early primitive darkroom slapping together photos that actually don't belong together to begin with.
This technology of its day was a sure way to make multiple images and combine them into one. There was no way the rewriters wouldn't need this for faking construction pictures. And no, it's not Photoshop, but the layering process is very similar. Victorian photography manipulation, using pencil markings and scraping techniques to draw, erase, and touch up any image desired. The easiest way to achieve your goals is to have a
Also, Victorian, the name Victoria, Victor, the victors of history, the Victorian age. Who are these victors making the Victorian age?
white background that you can remove later in the darkroom. Not uncommon for others to create trick photography and show off their masking and etching skills. For back then, this was the cutting edge of the start of this fraudulent society they've built.
They take an already completed building and they whitewash the skies. They call it vanilla skies.
They'll blotch out the sky and cut away from what they want to leave in the photo. They can cut away what was there and replace it with a gray or white vanilla colored sky.
Vanilla sky, where the background is cut out and you can see the crop marks. You can zoom in and see where the edge of the building there's a little bit of a blurry edge. The sky that would have been the background has been disappeared.
Yeah, I mean, in some of these images, that is very, very obvious, the manipulation. I wonder what the coincidences think about that.
So why would they do that? If you see one construction photo that's off, where they've peaked in scaffolding, or they've taken out backgrounds, you have to stop. Why did they go to the extent to do this? You have to ask a question. And if you see hundreds of photos that are done this way, you have to realize this was an industrial scale effort to create a narrative. Exquisite masonry buildings were built in 1 or 2 years. These take time. I mean, you put 1 or 2 years just into the planning. Well, before that, you have the engineering piece. You have the design. You're not just getting a bunch of artists and builders together and knocking these things out. There's architects involved, so there's design. Then there's the engineering of it. All of this takes time. These buildings are years in the making. And especially when you're crafting every single corner of it, like what we're seeing every doorknob, every cornice over a window is celebrated. And this is why the architecture is so beautiful. It's an architecture of celebration.
You have to ask yourself this. Why is there such a lack of construction photos from the inside of the buildings? The outside's incredible, but the inside is built like a palace. There's such a lack of photos from the inside of these buildings, and they're incredible. When you had the Kleksinski building in Chicago that took 14 years, and then you come back and you look at the one before that, the Federal building, built in 7 years. How is that possible? They're not gonna be able to bring these things all the way up to the top, get these people that have no training, and actually create this amazing thing that lasts forever. In a timeline where they tell you they were riding around on horses and wagons, where this should not be accepted.
I also kind of just thought of another theory. So this could go into the category of McGuire theories when it comes to all this stuff. Because he said the word timeline, and it got me thinking. What if there are literally different timelines, different dimensions, and the horse and buggy people somehow the timelines either merged or glitched, or possibly there was some kind of intentional technology to merge or jump or traverse time dimension timelines. And people that didn't belong in this timeline or dimension got here. And those are the horse and buggy people. So if there isn't just one timeline or dimension, does this make sense? Because if there are multiple ones and they intersected, or there was some kind of glitch, or maybe it's related to the Large Hadron Collider or something like that, where CERN, something similar to that in the past, glitched or merged timelines or dimensions. Does that make sense?
It's just not going to happen in the amount of time that they're telling us.
We know people cook the books in other areas. We know people have manipulated photos for the sake of deceiving people, just like NASA does. This isn't a new thing. It's an old thing, but it's still being done today. You find photo manipulation. Now, CGI, the techniques have developed substantially. But back then, they thought they were at the cutting edge. They didn't think that they would be caught on to.
Or maybe they didn't care. Like, by the time they figure this shit out, who cares? We'll be long gone, and who cares?
They have their stories. Everything has something to explain it within the last 100 to 200 years.
I even called the Illinois State Archives building, and they didn't have information on their own courthouse that's located within 1 mile of itself.
Illinois State Archives, how may I help you?
Hey, I was just transferred to you because I was looking at the Supreme Court when it was built, and I was just trying to find like records on it, and it said it was saying like on their website it was saying that it was built in like a year. So I was just trying to figure out if that was true or not.
I would have you tried contacting the Supreme Court?
Yeah, and they sent me over to you guys.
Okay. I don't know what we would have on the building itself. Let me look here.
Yeah, it was saying on their website that the keys were given over on February 4th, 1908, but 1908 they also said that they were moving out of the old state capitol building, so I don't know, 2 months, it doesn't sound right.
Yeah, that sounds kind of odd. Let's see here. I don't know if we have anything on the building itself.
So the entire Illinois State Archive doesn't have any information on the Supreme Court. Does anybody else find this funny? So there are just magically no records on any of these buildings? Does anybody find that weird?
No.
The stories that we've been told are basically just that. They're stories that we're repeating over and over, and we're just regurgitating what they've been telling us. You could either choose.
I mean, and for the coincidence theorists who don't find that strange, I mean, I actually still have the blueprints of a home from, I don't even know how old it was, but some old blueprint. I mean, people have blueprints to old family homes, even if they were just rudimentary sketches, but they have those for just a random small home. And yet they don't have any records for some of the biggest, most expensive buildings at the time that were built. I mean, this is kind of hilarious. I mean, is this like losing the telemetry data for the moon landings? I mean, as I mentioned, there were like I knew a bird watcher who had all of his data from bird watching on those old magnetic computer tapes. He had every single one on something as inconsequential as his own personal hobby of bird watching. And yet, with billions and trillions of dollars, they can't keep the telemetry data from allegedly the greatest accomplishment in the history of mankind, when even bird watchers can keep a record of their death. I mean, it's just so comical.
Choose to believe it, or you could choose to research and see the truth, that these are buildings from the past civilization.
I'm standing in front of the sunken ship parking garage, which is in the exact spot as the Occidental building. Now, the Occidental building was built supposedly in 1882 and was destroyed in the Great Fire. That was a giant masonry, massive 3-4 thick wall of just solid brick and stone that was somehow burned down in a fire. So this is what the modern era rolled out for us. We have the sunken ship parking garage, which is just kind of a thumb in the nose of this world that we're living in now. Yeah, salt in the wound, but I think it's just good that we remember the past and know what used to be there and the glory of the old world as it was.
On a lot of these old glorious structures, you'll start seeing old cheap banners, signs just kind of get slapped.
I'm going to throw in another McGuire here. I actually did a podcast episode on the Old World Order. I think I even called it the Old World Order in the Altered History series. Let me double check which episode that was. It was Altered History Episode 6, Old World Order and World Fairs. I did this one 4 years ago, so quite a while ago. This is 4 years ago I did that episode. And I went over the theory that the Old World Order was similar to the New World Order in that it was all about controlling the masses, and that the Old World Order were not the good guys. It was simply the power structure before the last reset. And so maybe these buildings are not by some kind of benevolent beings, but it was just a previous system of control. Now, maybe it was a lot better than this one, but that doesn't mean it was good per se. Because these still might have been rulers and controllers of some kind, and I think that's important to keep in mind.
To these old, glorious stone buildings. They simply don't fit together.
These buildings were not intended to become money-driven establishments, and those they kept turned into such. It's funny that we never hear through the passing down of generations stories regarding any of the difficulties a nation would face building a magnitude of stone and brick palaces.
Why are none of our grandparents or great-grandparents ever speaking highly of these buildings? If they were truly built in the early 1900s, do you think one of our grandparents would have been like, yeah, I was at the site and I'm so proud of building that? Or my friend, I knew somebody and he was over there building that building? Not one time. Does that sound odd? In order to build some of these buildings in a year, you'd have to have hundreds of people.
That's actually a really great point, because I do remember friends talking about how their family member worked on the construction of a stadium or something, like a big extraordinary construction project. There were always friends of friends or friends of family members. There were some degrees of separation of someone who literally worked on the project, or at least was across the street watching it being built. But that is a good point, where that doesn't seem to exist with any of this. I mean, is it even mentioned in any of these journals from like hundreds? Because people used to have their private journals, just like they do now. And is it ever is the construction of any of these buildings ever mentioned in any journal of any of the thousands of people living in any of these towns or cities?
Daily, sleeping there. You'd have to have people with houses located on site because they got their horse and their wagon. Are they traveling home at night? Where are these horses staying during the day when they're building these buildings? And it just, the story doesn't add up. If it was really true.
Wow, major mind-shocking comment here from Heracles. I think we are a lot closer to the Great Flood than we are told. And these buildings might be the Babylonian buildings. That's curious. That's curious, Heracles. I didn't put that together, but that's very, very interesting. Because was the Great Flood the last mud flood reset? Was Noah's, or, I mean, were there multiple great floods and multiple resets? And if this was Babylon, does that explain why it was all destroyed, so to speak? Or was this another civilization post-Babylon that suffered the same fate? If history repeats and there are many, many cycles, was Tartaria simply another Babylon?
Truly built, like they say, then there would be so much proof. And sorry, but saying that a photo wasn't available or hard to take back then, that's not gonna cut it. You've taken a photo before, why couldn't you take another one? They transported all these materials from hundreds of miles away, and it got there perfectly. There was never an issue. It just isn't logically possible.
As an architect of 20 years, I have a pretty good understanding of how materials react to the elements over time. The modern infrastructure of Seattle is at best 140 years old. There's no room in that narrative for a building to be showing the type of weathering that we're seeing beyond. So just to me, that one building alone is further evidence that this city was here for a long time. To me, it's been there for centuries. I would give this building 300 years. I like to look at a building as telling its own story.
I mean, this opens up a can of worms, too, because if buildings remained from previous civilizations and previous resets, like let's say these buildings were Atlantean, so if Babylon was a worldwide civilization as well, were there also Atlantean buildings around during the Babylonians? And then after the destruction of the Babylonians, were there both Atlantean and Babylonian buildings? And then if Tartaria was after that, were there still Atlantean and Babylonian buildings remaining during the reign of the Tartarians? And now in our modern times, there's a combination of all these types of buildings. Let's not fall for false dichotomy logical fallacies.
I'd like to say that stones don't lie. Stones are always going to tell you the truth. And if you look at it through that lens and you let it tell its own story, then something else emerges entirely.
There are blocks, stones used in some of the constructions of places like Machu Picchu, even St. Augustine, Florida, just sitting there, a hewn stone that no amount of men could have dragged. It would have taken something larger, something more technologically assisted. That is, of course, unless we're talking about people of substantial size.
In many ancient books all over the world, they speak of giants that existed and alongside what we would call regular-sized people now.
People who were larger might have had an easier time hauling, hewing, placing, arranging stones of this size that we see in the megaliths of the Americas, that we see in the megaliths of the whole world, may have been the result of giants.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm sold on the giants building everything narrative. Maybe some things in some areas, yes, particularly the so-called ancient civilization sites. But in terms of some of these modern, or more modern, possibly Tartarian buildings, I don't know, maybe they just used levitation, sound frequencies to manipulate matter and all of these things. Advanced tech of some kind. I'm not sure that it was simply just giants building stuff. I know that's a popular theory, but I'm not, if they had this other tech, antiquitech or otherwise, it just seems like they would use that. And were there really that many giants? I mean, I don't know. Yes, something else is here. They could have had some secret tech like what is said to have been used to build Coral Castle. Yes. I mean, that's kind of where I'm leaning, just because I think in the more distant past, maybe giants were used to build things, possibly also with other tech as well. Let's not fall for false dichotomies, of course.
If you're using critical thinking, it just doesn't make any sense as to why build at such a large scale for people our size.
That's the weirdest part, is when you have doorways in random buildings that are too big. They're 20 feet high. Why?
Yes, use your illusions. I'm with you. I think the larger size is to help accommodate giants, but not built by them specifically. Yeah, I'd be leaning in that direction as well.
Why would you build a door frame that's 20 feet high for a population that is so small?
Why would a regular sized human?
Or even if giants did build those buildings, they didn't necessarily use they still used the advanced tech to do so.
Not just why, but how would a regular sized human make something so massive? It just boggles the mind.
Why do 6-foot men and 5-foot women need that?
We don't do that. We build door frames that are proportionate to our size.
They're just absolutely huge.
Right, there's no sense.
No sense whatsoever. Church is exactly the same. They have just massive doors, and just like you go through a little door here to get in there. I noticed when I was in Europe last, they had some doors I took photographs of, and the lock on the door was up here. Yeah, for taller people.
You have these door frames that are in stone. You can't take them away. And they're 20 feet in the air or taller. And then you have our door frame that we build inside of the door frame so that we fit through normally. We're much shorter than they were as a civilization.
Think about it. You'd have to be a fucking moron to build a door that's 30 or 40 feet high if you're 6 foot tall, and you can't even reach the doorknob.
Across this plain, we find much evidence, abounding evidence of giants, not only in the major city centers of this world, but in the burial mounds and ancient ruins of the old world. And what you find around the major city centers is giant doorways.
Yeah, that's absolutely massive. I mean, that is a massive door. Also, the word giant. Ants are tiny. Giants. Antarctica. Andes Mountains. The land of giants. I did an early podcast on giants. It was actually one of the first podcasts on MINDSHOCK years ago, where we went over some of this stuff, but not all of it.
We had giant books. We had giant helmets. We had giant knives, giant samurai swords, giant rifles.
Yes, Rob. Antiquity. That's a good one. Antiquity. Yeah, and even anti anything, the opposite of. Giant, the opposite of a tiny ant, is a giant. Anti-ant is giant.
We had giant shoes.
Gigantic. Antic, the antics of ants.
We had giant crowns. We had giant typewriters, giant bells.
Giant this and that, things that don't seem suited.
Antiquity, anti-quiet, antiquity, not quiet, not quite, antiquity, quiety, quiet, quite quiet. Antenna, yes, connected to electricity, yeah. Interesting. Current. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, Joyce, that did remind me. If you haven't checked out the Reptilian podcast, where some people suppose that the bells would reveal reptilian shapeshifters due to the frequency of the giant bells, and they were all destroyed.
For the average sized person, even on the taller side, it just doesn't make sense. And to think that large communities of people got together and built structures that were excessive, costly to begin with, but then you're adding the factor that they're building for a greater size than they need. It's not very cost efficient. It's not in line with what we're told about frontier America.
So even just compared to me, right, in terms of a hip placement, my knee is up here and I'm 5'11". So these are really large individuals. Really large individuals.
And then when you think about it, it's not even that big of a deal, really. Like, what's the big deal? There was giant people.
I mean, I've seen some of the unearthings of skeletons of giants and all this type of shit. Like, and what's so funny is, you know, people will dismiss giants even though there's a myriad of evidence to, it, at the very least, suggest that they existed, right? But there's nothing that would even suggest that dinosaurs fucking existed. And y'all motherfuckers believe in them, okay? If you were to find giant bones like that. Oh, give me that. That's yeah. That's the femur of a velociraptor. Get the fuck out of here. This is bullshit.
The Smithsonian Institute has the bones. They found this at Cahokia. And there are articles saying that they took these bones from St. Louis area and put them in the Smithsonian Institute. They're not telling us that they have them, when really we know they're either in the basement or they destroyed them or threw them away. There's so many news articles from the 1800s and the early 1900s of them destroying or disposing of these bones into the ocean.
They had to cover it up. There's no room for giants in their new world, and they have to lie to us about it. They had to write the storybooks telling us that we came from monkeys.
I think everything was bigger. I think everything was much bigger. I think there was more oxygen in the air. The trees were much bigger. The places were much bigger. They were better. They had all the technology. These people may have left or may have been killed off. My opinion is that they went for more land. I don't think they're allowed to be here. I think this is all an operation to repopulate this place and to be controlled by the leaders, so-called leaders.
Okay, I'm going to stop this right here. We'll finish this up in part 2 tomorrow night, hopefully. But I just want to give this final thought here. Is it possible that this realm is meant as kind of either level 1, or who knows, maybe this is level 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 20, and then there's the next level where civilization cycles. Once you reach a certain civilization level, you have to go to the next outer circle, possibly. If Antarctica is some kind of circle that encircles this whole realm, perhaps these beings, once they achieved a certain status in this realm, whoever controls all the realms, now they're no longer allowed to be here for whatever reason. They achieved a certain civilization status, and now they have to move to the next realm in the outer lands of Antarctica or whatever. And perhaps our current civilization, when it achieves a certain level, then we would have to do the same, and then there would be a new civilization group that would come and inherit all of our technology and all of the technology that came from before in this realm, in this particular realm. And then once they reach a certain level, then they migrate to the outer lands as well. And this is just the natural cycle of things. Perhaps either related to blood type or not, maybe Native American populations or Aborigines or whoever, maybe they're exempt for whatever reason from these cycles. I don't know. I mean, yeah, it's definitely weird, but this last point made in the documentary here regarding them having to leave after achieving a certain status, I do wonder if that's just the natural state of the realm here. But hope everybody enjoyed the first watch party on MindShock, and we'll be finishing this up tomorrow with plenty more discussions. So thanks again for joining us. If you want to help support the MindShock podcast, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. Make sure to subscribe, like, and share. Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, Patreon. Patrons do get priority for case topic, logical analysis, co-podcast requests. You could also be a guest on the podcast depending on your tier. And you could also become a YouTube member right here on YouTube. Help support the channel that way. This is Bruce McGuire signing off. Catch you guys next time.